Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Kassia and I spoke with Helen Lewis, who is the deputy editor at the New Statesman magazine.
We spoke to her in the bowels of the New Statesman offices, and she was really interesting about lots of different topics, including her time as a trainee sub-editor at the Daily Mail, and also gave a very useful tip about what to do when you're staring down the barrel of writer's block.
A really informative interview and a lot to take away from this one, so we hope you enjoy it.
Helen, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for coming to... Yeah, we call it the podcast bunker.
The podcast bunker.
Yeah.
I like it. Could you start off by telling us about your kind of entry into journalism?
Deeply conventional, I suppose, in that I did English at university. I was at St Peter's College, Oxford, and then after that I went to City University, where I did what was then the postgraduate diploma in newspaper journalism, and I walked straight out of that into the Daily Mail trainee scheme as a sub-editor. And everyone at the time, I remember, being quite sort of snobby about why no one would want to be a sub, and they'd kind of like, don't you want to be a reporter? Don't you want to be kind of there in your flak jacket under fire? And I was like, yeah, but the bit that I really want to do is the bit where you take the raw materials and you kind of craft it into a package and a story, because that's particularly on a mid-market like the Mail, that's the bit where you actually tell the story. It's about the presentation. You know, the copy is a sort of starting point in a negotiation. It's not like it would be on a magazine like the New Statesman. So I did that for I think nearly 5 years, and then got a transfer over to the features commissioning desk. Which was a rather more brutal environment than the rather nicer waters of the news subs department. So after about a year of that, I decided to jump ship and ended up applying for a job here as assistant editor, which I got, and I did that for 2 years, and then I got promoted to deputy editor, and now I've been ensconced ever since. So yeah, I freelanced all over the place, and I did lots of shifts around the place, but I've only had 2 big employers in my career.
And rolling back to the start, what was the Mail like as a place to work, and particularly that training program we were just talking off air that has a reputation for brutality and also locating you in a sort of grim northern town for an indeterminate period of time. Is that correct? I
kind of talked my way out of the grim northern town. I mean, there are lovely northern towns as well, but you have to train in a very small village called Howden, which is outside Hull. That's the Press Association's training base. So I went and did that. But because I'd already got a flat in London, I was in part in a flat share, I kind of basically said that I just can't, because the salary was then £15,000 a year. I'm not sure what it is now, but I mean, this was in 2003, but nonetheless, like, not that, we haven't had exactly kind of Weimar style inflation. It was still a very difficult amount of money to live on at the time. And I said, look, I just can't afford to pay my rent in London and pay rent even on somewhere that you find me. So they let me off, and I got to do my my placement at the Metro. And then, which was then in Canada Water, and then I turned up early to the Daily Mail, and it was fine. A couple of different things about working at the Mail. Right, okay, let's not beat around the bush. It is a tough working environment. Like, you don't produce a paper like that by just everybody kind of swanning around and having a lovely time and dropping in at 3 p.m. and doing a bit of work. It's incredibly demanding. What it did do, which I think is something that it doesn't get enough credit for, is it actually paid for you to be trained. So I'd already done a master's nearly, but in terms of actually the craft of teaching how to do stuff, they paid for that, and that was a big investment that they made in you at the time. I think it's less so now with training for people for online. I think they kind of throw them more in at the deep end. So I think that deserves some amount of credit, because I think there's quite a lot of hatred towards the Mail, particularly from the left, which I consider myself to be on. But I think there are some very exploitative practices that happen at other places that consider themselves to be much better than the Mail, but really use up and spit out young writers, and just still want them to be writing the same loads and loads of pieces a day, but because they don't have the reputation of the Mail, kind of get away with it a bit more. But it's not a friendly place to work. Certainly Paul Dacre is an editor of enormous power. I think one of the very last editors who will ever have that kind of incredible power over the newsroom, which makes for a very muscular paper, but they also makes for a very, very tough working environment.
And is it true about the brutality of the night shifts? I've had friends who have had miserable times, living nocturnal, very depressing lives.
Well, at the time I was there, I was only the paper. I mean, so the Daily Mail website was, this is how old I am. The Daily Mail website was kind of launched in its current glorious incarnation when I was there, and everyone was very, very sniffy about it, because we went, it's got full of spelling mistakes. It's not going, because there was a real kind of craft about the subbing of the paper. People really took pride in it, and there were people who'd been there, for 30 or 40 years. Who will want to read this thing that's sort of riddled with typos? Turns out you put enough pictures of Kim Kardashian getting out of a car, no one really cares if you've misspelled the in the second sentence. So it was very interesting to see that, but I only ever worked on the paper. I had a very short secondment to online, but so I was working to paper deadlines, which was in a way was a very freeing job. So the classic shift was 3:30 in the afternoon till 11:30 at night. First edition went around 9 o'clock. Most of the time the subs would then go to the pub, come back, do second edition. So again, a kind of last days of a particular kind of Fleet Street life. Early deadlines on a Friday, so then everyone really did go to the pub. But some of the shifts went on until 3 in the morning. But equally well, at the time I started it, we worked a 4-day week. That then moved to a 9-day fortnight. So it was, there was a kind of payback for the amount of time that you were working. It was understood that those were difficult working hours to kind of judge with a life. And actually I really loved it, because at the time, I was still living a kind of my late student life, which was that I really enjoyed having a lie-in until 10 o'clock in the morning. And I did an Open University MA in my spare time, so I would get up this is what SWAT I am, I would get up in the morning and go to the British Library for a couple of hours and then go into work.
And did the people who work there, did they kind of identify with the mission or the message of the Mail, or did they, how does it work mentally, or did they feel that there was a complete separation in some cases between the institution they worked for and who they were as people?
I don't think everyone there subscribed to all the values of the Mail, but in a way I find, this is going to get me into a lot of trouble, but in a way I find it quite admirable, because there are a lot of people in Britain for whom the Mail speaks, right? And actually journalists don't tend to have the same social attitudes as those people. So I think that journalism is overwhelmingly now dominated by graduates, by people who live in the southeast, all of these things. And actually, therefore, culturally, we are quite disconnected often from the large majority of people who read papers. So, the majority of, as I think I understand it, Mail readers are C2DEs, they're a bit older, they're much more socially conservative than most journalists. But I sort of think, in a way, although I think the Mail is often an extremely unnecessarily vicious paper, in terms of the attitudes that it espouses, it does reflect its readers more. And therefore, it will be slightly, I think there is a slight disconnect between the journalists in the newsroom and their readers, but I think it would be sort of strange if that weren't the case, because of the cultural background that most journalists come from. One of the things that I think is really sad, when I worked there were some incredibly brilliant subs, really truly kind of absolutely gifted in the way they could craft a story, write a very funny headline. Now we don't really have funny headlines anymore, because everything has to be written for Google, so a robot understands it rather than a human finds pleasure in it. But and these people had often left school at 16 without maybe any qualifications, worked on a local paper, and just because they were really good worked their way up. And I remember one of them saying to me, well, that won't happen again, your lot won't ever have to sit through 20 years of council meetings, because we were the graduate trainees. So there was this kind of old journalism versus new journalism model that was going on.
Another thing from that period in your life that we wanted to talk about was that you saw a potential problem in young journalism, or for young journalists, in that there wasn't this very strong network, and you created kind of a networking event that ran for several years. Can you talk more about that and why you felt it was important to do that?
Yeah, I felt there used to be a kind of Fleet Street culture, and it was one of the things that attracted me to being a journalist, reading things like Michael Frayn's Towards the End of Morning or Scoop by Evelyn Waugh. Not that those are kind of models for what you want journalism to be like, but they made journalism look like quite a fun, full of people who didn't take themselves too seriously, people who were, who saw the kind of essential ridiculously of the job. And that didn't happen when you were sitting. Someone once described the Daily Mail offices as looking like a third world travel agent. And they really do, right? There's just a really unpleasant carpet and these sort of weird ventilation stuff and strange internal lighting. Even though it's, in a very plush bit of London in High Street, Kensington. And I just thought, this is really strange. My job is basically to sit in miles away from a window. It's dark most of the time I'm working anyway. This doesn't kind of, feel like I'm part of a kind of community of journalists. Never mind the fact that I'm not meeting people who work on other papers. And remember, this was 2004-05 kind of time, so actually before the founding of Facebook, and before Twitter. So now all of those functions, actually, that's the kind of virtual pub of journalism, right? That's where most of the time I talk to other people at completely different publications I would never see. So it's been recreated very effectively there. Like old Fleet Street is now Twitter, basically. Well, certainly for political journalists, but at the time there was no way of doing that.
And can you talk a bit about what sub-editing involved as a process, maybe for people who aren't so familiar with the term?
Yeah, it's very different in my experience, between tabloids. Certainly then, I haven't done it for 10 years, properly, and broadsheets. In broadsheets, the kind of classic model is that all the all the reporters consider themselves to be craftsmen and women who kind of turn in these finely tuned stories, and then it's the sub's job is merely to sort of check them for spelling errors and put it straight into the paper. But at the time as a print sub, particularly on the Mail for say showbiz stories, a lot for cute animal stories, for lighter stories, your job was to basically take the facts that were kind of written out in a very straight way and bring them to life. And I think whatever you think about the Daily Mail, and lots of people I know who are liberals guiltily read it all the time because its story selection is incredible. Like, it's just always got something in it you want to read. And like the attention to detail is paid to everything is kind of, nothing goes in there that's just sloppily shoved in. Very different to the website where everything is kind of sloppily shoved in. So that's what the subs did. They kind of created that paper. It's also weirdly, I think, slightly analogous to The Economist in the sense that there is a distinctive Mail style to everything that runs through that paper, just DNA, that is absolutely surpasses any individual writer. And actually the writers have to kind of become maily rather than, which can be very flattening. And I think probably you can make the same criticism of The Economist, that actually as a read it can almost become slightly monotonous because you're just getting the same thing. There's not and whereas if you read something more like maybe The Guardian, there is a bit more, you have people from lots of different I would wish them in some ways in The Guardian people from a wider range of political backgrounds, but the Mail has got this sensibility that runs absolutely through it, and it's the subs really who kind of create that because everything goes through them. But
do they make stuff up?
No. I mean, no. How would they make stuff up?
Well, I don't know. It's just a fairly straightforward question.
I mean, it's a big, rich organisation. You'd have to be pretty confident that you weren't going to get sued. I mean, that's one of the things that is interesting about it, is it takes legal risks that other places wouldn't because it's got such a big mallet to wallop people with. And they slightly fetishise their bravery over the Stephen Lawrence case, I think, as a way to deflect criticism on race issues more generally. But nonetheless, that was at the time an incredibly brave call to make, and an ongoing, they could have been sued into the end of next week over that, and they would pour resources into stuff that they wanted to report it. So no, I don't think the Mail's problem is factual. I think the Mail's problem is about the relentlessness of the political messaging that accompanies everything that they do, and actually the relentlessly aggressive way they pursue stories in terms of doorstepping people and sense. I was there during the time that Amy Winehouse was collapsing, and I think the way that the tabloids behaved over that was incredibly reprehensible, right? And they just basically followed her around, shouting at her, because she always made very good copy. And at the end of the night, hey presto, there would be a photo of a drunk Amy Winehouse sort of sobbing in some street with bloodstained ballet pumps. So I think that's the bit that I would criticise more than, I don't know if you can just, flat out fiction is not something that I think I've really encountered during my career. I would think about whether or not I can think of any instance, but I can't off the top of my head, no.
Sure.
We'd like to talk to you about sort of leaving, why you left and your move to the New Statesman.
So I was on the features desk, and that was just, honestly, it was, let me be really honest about it. It was a horrible job because you were there from 9:30 in the morning until 9:30 p.m. every day, 5 days a week, because there was quite a high staff turnover at the time I was there, and I was working 1 in 3, 1 in 4 Sundays. So it just took up every moment of your waking life. So
and were you compensated for that huge amount of work and long hours in pay at all, or was it still very badly paid?
I was paid very well for, I was in my mid-20s at that point. I was earning as much as any of my friends, probably more, apart from people who worked in the city or crazy things like that. No, it was a very good solid job, like above the London average pay, and I was only 26 or 7, but I did feel like I sort of inhaled on a Monday morning, like at 9:30, and into the office, and then I only exhaled on a Friday evening at kind of 8 p.m. when we'd sent the paper. You just couldn't do anything in the evening, you couldn't see any friends in the evening. It wasn't like, because subbing had at least been kind of nights off, but you basically spent Saturday just kind of zoning out and recovering. If you wanted to have dinner with anybody, you had to have dinner at 10:30 at night. It was it was.
And you mentioned in that Medium piece that you sent us that it was kind of the relentlessness, not just of the pressure, but of having to have 4 more ideas the next day, like the kind of bang, bang, bang.
Which
almost
really,
a creative exhaustion.
Yeah, no, definitely. And also, because the thing I think about now, because I write a lot now and I'm writing a weekly column, and everyone thinks that they can write a weekly column, and most people can write a weekly column. Can you write the second weekly column, the third weekly, like the fourth weekly column? It is a fundamentally really creatively exhausting process. I'm not comparing it to going down a mine or anything, but you know what I mean? It is a lot harder than people think, because actually you've just got to have more and more ideas. So the Mail was kind of good training for that, and also about not being precious about the idea that this is my, you know, my masterwork, and I pick, because you just have to throw things into the bucket and kind of see what sticks. And also about not being lazy. I remember they bought Patrick Barkham, a Guardian writer, who wrote a book about butterflies. I think it was like there are 50 butterflies in Britain, right? 50 species of butterfly, and he tried to do a quest to see every single one. So they bought this. What does the Mail decide to do, because it's the Mail, to run it on a Saturday with every single species of butterfly as a border around the page, and we had to label them all and check that they were all different, and then we got the male and female of each one. And I sat there for like 3 hours looking at these bloody butterflies that were virtually identical, going, right, that's a marsh fritillary, right, that's a lesser-tailed. And I just thought, this is only the Mail. I remember when I did a placement at the Times before I even started at the Mail, where there was a graphic of every British soldier who'd been killed in Iraq. This would have been when I was at the Times on a scholarship, I think. And the Mail had gone and found a photo of everybody, and their paper had everyone, and the picture desk had done all that amount of research. And that was the thing that I saw that everyone else kind of admired about the Mail. I remember I was doing a placement at the Observer, and one of the editors there said, you know, because I was agonised, because I've always been quite left-wing about whether or not I should go and work on the Mail, and she said, you know, the thing is, they, like, what doesn't kill you will make you stronger. Like, they will, you know, you won't take any shortcuts. It's not a place where you're allowed to be lazy. But the reason I say about being honest about it was that, and I think this is an experience lots of people have in journalism and people don't want to talk about, is that moving from there to here, I experienced it was a huge relief, but I also experienced it as a sense of personal failure, that I couldn't hack it. And some part of me thought this was incredible. Like, I'd been on one of those sort of SAS Are You Tough Enough programmes, and I'd pulled out at the sort of third 15-mile hike. And now I watch those programmes and I'm like, just leave, you're having a terrible time. You know, you've got like dysentery and your foot's falling off, just leave. But now I can understand the impulse that you feel that there's a big challenge that you've been presented with. But now I look at those people and I think, actually, it's a kind of Stockholm syndrome, particularly when you're paid really, really well, you've got a certain lifestyle that you're used to, and then you will, like, there's a lot that you will put up with in terms of workplace culture, in terms of hours, in terms of whatever, because actually you're sort of scared about what life would be like on the outside.
And you've also bought into the myth.
Yeah, I'm not so much. I'm not sure. There's a lot of people there who are thinking that they're kind of, you know, as they lay out a spread about.
Not the myth of the Mail, I mean the myth of that kind of Fleet Street way of life, and working hard and being tough enough.
I mean, it's a very, very macho kind of place. I think that's the thing that's really noticeable. I'm sure, you know, it has always had a certain number of female executives, but as a kind of culture, there were a lot of men there whose wives didn't work.
Have you read Alex Starrett's novel The Beast?
No, but he was also a sub on the Mail, so lots of people I know who were subs kind of were like, yeah, we always knew he was sort of writing a novel in his spare time.
It's a novel, we should say, based on a newspaper that, you know, its origins couldn't possibly be stated, but, you know, Alex was a sub at the Mail, and it is an interesting examination of a certain culture.
I must read it, but I don't know whether or not I bought that Adrian Addison's book Mailmen, that's all about the history of the Daily Mail, and I started sort of flicking through it, and then I sort of thought,
why am I doing this myself?
It's like, you know, I don't think anyone who was in the, you know, Korean War read a lot of stuff about the Korean War afterwards. I know that's a terrible comparison to make, but I just thought, no, hang on a minute, I lived through this, and quite a lot of it was quite unpleasant. I don't think I really want to live through it again, thank you.
Well, let's not dissect any further. Could you talk about your move here and what it, you know, your start of your time here?
Yeah, the thing that's really fascinating is, so, you know, if there was a feature on the Mail, and maybe it was your commission, then you'd have kind of first crack at writing the headline on it, and then a load of executives would come in and all rewrite it, and then usually at about 9-10 p.m. Paul Dacre would come along, and then he would rewrite it to what you had originally done, and then you just think, why I could have been home so much longer ago. And then I remember my second week here, Jason, our editor, I sort of said to him, this headline, wouldn't it be better as this? And he went, oh yeah, just change that then. And I kind of went, hang on a minute, where are the other 19 people who are all going to kind of put their finger in this pie? And because it's such a small team, the thing I would say when I'm hiring people...
How big is the team?
So I think there's 25 of us. I mean, it's complicated because we have quite a few people who work part-time, which is really nice because it means that there are lots of parents of young kids in the office and they're able to make it work. So Erica, our design director, works 2 days a week. Jerry, our creative editor, works 4 days a week. Tom, who's now a books and features editor, had last year, the year before, he took 3 months of parental leave. So that's one of the things that's quite nice about working on a weekly magazine, is it has the ability to have those slightly more kind of flexible structures. And then there's a web team as well. We're mediumly integrated. We're not fully because there are specific jobs that have to be just done for print, but and only print. But yeah, the thing I always say to people when recruiting here is, the joy of working at the New Statesman is that you can do anything. The sort of downside to that is you have to do everything, right? You can't be somebody who's just an incredible specialist, who's like this sort of perfectly honed sort of specialist knife that only, does this thing. You have to be a kind of Swiss Army knife, I guess.
And given that point, what are the things that you do? All of them?
All of the things that I do. Right, okay.
List them.
Right, let's... at the moment I'm only working 2 days a week because I'm writing a book, but normally my duties... So Monday and Tuesday are our production days, so we go to press every week on a Tuesday night, and then it's out on newsstands on Thursday in London and Friday in the rest of the country. So Monday and Tuesday, I'm at my desk. We have an editorial meeting on a Monday morning in which we talk about what's going to be in that issue. We do a lot of forward planning in advance, obviously, but then there is a kind of complete step back on Monday morning about, hang on a minute, is this the right cover story? Is there anything we need to pick up in the columns, all that kind of stuff. So Monday I'll be editing columns that come in after the weekend, talking to Erica about the cover. So at the moment we've made a real effort in the last couple of years to build up a bank of illustrators, because finding a cover style for us has been quite hard. And the most successful magazine in the current affairs market is Private Eye, and one of the things that's really nice about them is they do a joke on the cover every week. And actually we've had quite a lot of success with Andre Carrillo, who does our caricatures now. You have to be so careful of, if you're running a current affairs magazine, that you don't want people to feel this is homework. You want to promise that, yes, it's quite educational, it's very informative, but it is actually also pleasurable to read, and it will have different tones in it and light and shade. So that's one bit of my job. Obviously I write for the magazine as well, and one of the things I particularly enjoy doing is long form pieces, particularly profile writing. I have a weekly column. I do a bit of reviewing, book reviews, theatre reviews occasionally from time to time. And then, at the moment, I do broadcast around it, so I will do the paper review on Andrew Marr's show. I've got an essay going out on Radio 4 for their Word of Mouth series, so I do some of that kind of public-facing stuff. I do a bit of the strategy stuff, not very much. We're launching a paywall soon, so I haven't been massively involved in that, but I've kind of kept my eye on it. And then what else already? And I'm writing a book. Yeah, that keeps me busy.
And the editor himself, how hands-on is he at a place like this? Is he sort of rolling up his sleeves and doing those tasks as well, or is he taking sort of more strategic direction while you run the place day to day?
No, we don't have a publisher or managing editor, so he does a lot of those functions. So he is tied up a lot with that kind of the business side of it and business development. But no, his interests particularly are philosophy. He's a philosophy graduate, and also world affairs, and he's been really instrumental in bringing in writers like Shiraz Maher and John Bew, both out of King's College London. And his sort of particular expertise and interest is in either about big political ideas or big geopolitics ideas. We've been very strong on Syria, for example, on charting the kind of rise of ISIS and then the kind of complications that arose from that, which is, I'm interested in that kind of stuff, but it's not my particular passion. So what our interests are quite complementary in that sense. And then the other senior editor is Tom, who now works across books and features, and he comes from a literary background, so he's very much interested in ideas and things that are kind of coming out of fiction and non-fiction. So we've got a good spread across us in terms of the things that we're interested in, and that means that we all tend to edit our own writers that we've kind of brought in, and we all tend to edit around the things that are our particular specialism. I wouldn't feel massively confident editing 4,000 words on what's happening in Syria. It's not my particular... you should as an editor be able to deal with anything, because you just go a bit slower and you check everything a lot better. But in terms of actually being able to capture, well, hang on, what's the kernel of this piece? What's the new thing that I'm finding out here? My specialisms are more about things like tech, for example. And obviously feminism is a big interest of mine, and cultural stuff more broadly.
I think we're going to return to the kind of the nuts and bolts of commissioning and editing a little bit later, but could we just zoom out for a second and talk about do you have like a sort of a thumbnail sketch version of the New Statesman and the role it performs sort of in the ecosystem of British journalism?
Oh yeah, okay, that's a dangerous question. So it was founded in 1913 by the Fabians, by Beatrice and Sidney Webb. And published some really interesting stuff early on, both around poverty. It published Virginia Woolf, it published Rebecca West, it published a terrible interview by H.G. Wells with Stalin, in which he said, "Oh, how's Stalin?" There's a great one which says, "Stalin, it seems to me that I'm more to the left than you," or something like that. And you think, it's a kind of terrible model of a really incredibly fawning political interview, which we republished for our centenary. So Jason's vision of it has always been that one of the Statesman is least good when it is in the, it's very closely aligned to the Labour Party or very doctrinaire about being on the left. He was always wanted it to be sceptical and plural and independent, and that's been, that is a challenge now when there is a lot of pressure from the left to be, well, as they say it, roll in behind Corbyn. And the argument that I always make is, I think Peter Wilby's editorship of the Statesman was characterised by the fact that he did not go along with the Iraq War, which was precisely the correct decision to make, and there was a lot of pressure on a magazine, particularly what we've ever seen at the time. It was seen as Labour's House Journal, or the magazine of Orwell is what people call us when they're trying to be nice about us. That you would kind of, well, hang on, this is the first Labour government we've had in ages. You should be behind them, and he resisted that. And I think the same pressure is there now, and the same resistance is that we're not there. We're there to articulate a set of principles and measure each politician against them, rather than to be tribal in any way. So that's where I see it. So we usually say left-leaning rather than it's a left-wing magazine, because it's open to other voices from other bits of the political spectrum, but it does still have that identity that comes out of Fabianism and what that meant. But that's a very complicated legacy in itself. I mean, like a lot of other people on the left in the 20s, the Webbs were eugenicists. I mean, there are some dark things in almost the history of almost every publication to reckon with. But that's where it is now. And it's a small magazine in terms of circulation. I think our headline circulation is now around 30,000. That depends on fluctuations in newsstand. But the things that are difficult for us are about display advertising, and that's something that everybody across the whole industry has found quite difficult, particularly over the last couple of years. There's been a real chill. We're making a lot of money from internet advertising, but the feeling has always been, my strong advocacy has always been, that you should just say thank you and bank that now, but also try and really diversify your revenue as much as you possibly can, which is why we're launching a paywall, which only a small fraction of the number of readers will ever meet, because it's designed to be after 4 articles that you have to pay. But it will mean that people who do use us all the time end up paying, which I think is actually on principle is something that I think is really important. I think it's really interesting. The Guardian is doing very well out of membership, but also about donation. Like, even they won't say, there's still a kind of ideological resistance to the idea of a paywall, but not now to the idea of that people need to pay. That need to pay. Yeah, people need to pay, not just advertisers need to pay. And I would always much rather that our readers paid more and that we shifted that balance. Because then if those are the people who are paying your wages, then ultimately you can't afford to piss them off. They're the most important people, and that's not an argument you just have to make on ethical grounds. It then becomes a commercially viable argument too.
Just following on from those points you said about both the process of editing and writing within an ideological framework, and I think this would apply equally to a publication like The Spectator on the other side of the divide. How, if you're kind of working I suppose would it be fair to say the two big ideological areas you're working in would be, kind of broadly speaking, left-wing politics in the magazine and feminism and some of your own interests. How does that shape the decision-making process in terms of what you're putting in? I suppose the classic example that springs to mind is, during the Spanish Civil War, the New Statesman spiked a piece that Orwell ran criticising Republican excesses,
Yeah.
And that always seems to me to be an example of some of the potentially quite difficult or dangerous pitfalls you can get into where you are a publication with a political stance. So how do you go about walking that line, as it were? And I suppose, particularly with the Corbynite piece and so forth as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, those discussions about, because there's a big sort of thing about people getting spiked, and sometimes pieces deserve to be spiked. I was thinking at the weekend about, remember Julie Birchall's terrible article she wrote about transgender people for The Observer, which she wrote as off the back of defending Suzanne Moore for a piece that she wrote for us, and it was just full of gratuitous insults. And eventually they wiped that from the internet, like they wiped it off the Observer website, which was borderline the correct decision to do. But really, someone at some point should have said, what is the editorial outcome of publishing a load of gratuitous insults about a marginalised group? It's not advancing the conversation. It's not making a good faith argument about anything, right? It's just there to be mean for the sake of it. So I think it's very easy. I think there are some people on the left who see any kind of editorial intervention as being kind of censorship, and it's needlessly self-dramatising, because editing is nothing but censorship, right? You're constantly deciding who you're not going to publish, how you're going to...
Which choice, right?
Yeah, which bit you're going to cut. Like, it's not like... There is no magazine in history that just says to everyone in the world, send us stuff and we will publish everything that you want to write. That's YouTube comments, isn't it? And therefore they're quite grisly as a result. So I think that what we try and do is work out where the limits are of, for example, what things are hate speech, what things are gratuitously offensive to no purpose, what things are tough and people might find them incendiary, but we think there is a genuine point that is being made there in good faith. And I think that's one of the things that I always think of when we're publishing something that I feel is going to get us into trouble is this true? Is this something that needs to be said? And is it being said in good faith to advance a cause, or advance a principle that I believe in? And I think what happens sometimes is that, the pieces that you don't want to be able to stand up and defend would be pieces that are just there's someone just... I think my colleague Stephen described them once as just like a man walking into a room and dropping his trousers. Those pieces where there's no point to them other than just to be like, are you triggered, libs? Or whatever it turns out to be. They don't actually add anything to the conversation apart from petrol. So I think I would always defend us publishing stuff that people find really challenging within those limits.
What role does diversity in a newsroom play into this? Because obviously what is offensive can change dramatically with who's doing the judging.
Yeah, and the media as a whole is really undiverse, but I've been thinking a lot about this recently because I got into trouble a while ago. A writer on the internet said, I criticised the shadow cabinet, which at the time didn't have very much ethnic minority representation. And someone said, well, how much ethnic minority representation does the New Statesman have? And I said, based on the figures at the time, it was 20% BME. And they said, so it'd be about how many in senior roles. And I said, well, at the time our chief sub-editor was a black woman. And this person kind of kept coming back at me. And I said, well, look, and I think there is a problem that needs to be addressed, but actually looking at the headline figures only gets you so far, because where the problem is at entry level, and actually if we put out an advert for a senior editor role or for a political correspondent, then particularly in politics, those applicants will be overwhelmingly male and they will be overwhelmingly white. They will be overwhelmingly Oxbridge graduates. Right, so actually, just by the time you get to that point, the problem is already incredibly entrenched. So what I wanted to do, and we've run for several years, is funded by the Wellcome Foundation, is a programme for BME aspiring science journalists, because I think what actually you really need to do is just give more people the opportunities at the start, so that then actually your applicants look much more like the population at large, because it's very hard 20 or 30 years in someone's career to be able to fix that problem. For women particularly, as I say, one of the things that's nice about working on a weekly is that on print that we're able to be slightly flexible about working hours, which I think is very helpful. But I look around the media, I do feel there is a huge attrition of women at senior levels. I think most journalism courses probably now majority female. They certainly were when I was at City. It was a majority women, and then I have absolutely no problem recruiting women in their 20s. Women in their 30s and 40s, more difficult because they tend to move sideways either into PR, which is just much more stable and more regular income, or into freelance writing. And I'm deputy chair of Women in Journalism, and this kind of conversation came up among a group of senior editors. And the conversation basically came to the fact that no, you cannot have it all. And actually almost every woman in that room who was very senior and had children had done something, like either their husband had given up work, or they had gone to be a foreign correspondent for a while, or they had hired in an enormous amount of help which they could only afford because of their salary was quite high. So I think that, in terms of gender, the problems are really deeply structural and related to care work, and also related to the insecurity of it as a career and the hours, and particularly being a reporter, you might be asked to kind of go off at 7 o'clock at night to Manchester if there's been a terror attack or something like that. Well, that's just fundamentally very hard to do if you've got a 2-year-old, or if you're looking after an elderly parent. So yeah, I think that diversity is an enormous problem, but my problem is that whether or not it's being fixed. So I was thinking about writing about this, and I think if you tell the whether or not a diversity scheme is working by whether or not it costs any money. I think that's the point, isn't it? Like you can say all the sort of warm words you want about trying to bring other people on, but are you actually spending any money on it? And that's what I felt that the welcome scheme was really important, because that was paid at London living wage, and that was giving people who might not, particularly because they were from science backgrounds, giving people who wouldn't otherwise maybe have looked at journalism or thought that they could, risk this as a career, an entry route into it. And I'm very proud that several of the people who did that now are working in journalism.
Kind of moving backwards, but also tying in some ways to the same theme. Where do you see the place of reporting, and particularly the longer reported pieces in a magazine, in a political magazine? And I suppose the extension of that is, you were talking earlier about some of the tensions between editorial decisions and the stance of the magazine with regard to, I suppose, opinion-led pieces. But what I feel another tension. What I feel the idea of reporting is you go out and you sort of test your preconceptions against the world, and if the world says they're wrong, you acknowledge they're wrong. So how does that fit, commissioning and editing, that kind of thing, with the magazine again?
Yeah, I don't think there's a conflict with that at all, because you have to go where the reporting takes you. And actually I find, I don't know about you guys, but when you're interviewing somebody, particularly somebody who's been involved in big controversies, it's best to just put it to them flat out, right? Which is say, look, the criticism of you is X, like what is your response to that? You're just not trying to kind of tiptoe around it. But we've done some very challenging reporting. I was just thinking, because of all this stuff about the Telford child sexual exploitation stuff, Daniel Trilling, who was an assistant editor here, is now editor of the New Humanist magazine, did a piece from, I'm going to get it wrong about whether it was Rochdale rather than Rotherham, and really prodded into some of that stuff about the nighttime economy, about race and class, that was really difficult in that. But you've just got to just listen to what people are telling you, and that's the only point of reporting, isn't it? That you might actually end up with we're coming to completely different conclusions than the ones that you went in with. And I don't think we'd have any problem publishing that, because you don't commission someone particularly to do something like that, which you have to invest a lot of time in, unless you absolutely trust them as a reporter. You trust that they are talking to all the people that they say they are, that they are presenting the situation accurately. So whatever they see on the ground, sorry if it doesn't agree with what you thought was from your lofty perch in EC4, but that's what you print.
Can it be challenging to get younger writers who've come up churning a lot of stuff for the web, or through a kind of hot takes economy that's very opinion led? Can it be challenging as an editor to get them to stretch their legs in that kind of direction with longer reported pieces?
Yeah, because no one's born knowing how to write a 4,000 word feature, and it's a very different discipline to being able to like even writing a 1,000 word column, and it's not one that everybody enjoys. The problem with it is it's really time consuming, and I think everything comes back to money ultimately, and we have the luxury here of a magazine that we charge a reasonable amount of money for, that we have subscriptions that we charge a reasonable amount of money for. We can't do that kind of stuff online because the overheads are just different, and that's what does really worry me. That's why I'm so happy that the FT's paywall has worked out really well, The Economist has worked out really well, because there are the LRB is doing very well, and Private Eye is doing very well, and it doesn't do long reads, but it does proper, it will send someone to every 6 weeks of that court case, because those functions are really, I think, really, and actually talking about court reporting, the lack of coverage of local court cases now is very, very worrying. So the BBC's obviously the kind of, you think will do that kind of bread and butter stuff, but with local papers going bust, and those used to be a big source of stories for the nationals too, and a really useful kind of civic function that journalism used to have, that's kind of dying out. But there is no way, if we were purely an online only organisation, we would not be able to make the economics of long form reporting work, because the CPM on advertising is just not enough to support that. So it's something that's helped by us doing a print magazine, and it's one of the reasons why we want to do a paywall, because that's the kind of journalism we want to do. I just, I am someone with extremely strong opinions, and sometimes I will write it is a hot take. It's like sometimes my takes are extremely hot, but that's not done for effect, and I'm not doing 9 of them a day because I've been asked to, and that's the only way to make money. And I think there is a real worry I have about young journalists who come in, and particularly the only way that they can. So lots of young journalists now, I think, really want to be opinion economists in the way that my generation all wanted to be foreign correspondents. That was the kind of glamorous, sexy thing that you got a lot of love for. And the way to do that really is to write, again, I'm stealing this from Stephen Bush, why I as an X think Y about Z. And I think that can become quite restrictive to people. Every woman I know who writes about feminism worries a lot about whether or not they're kind of stereotyping themselves, or it's, they're going to be seen as some way limited or obsessive or narrow. And I kind of go, well, they have transport correspondence. Like, this is feminism really encompasses like the issues of half of the population, so it's not a kind of niche specialism at all. But I think that you end up, if you don't bring on reporters and you end up people kind of churning stuff out, then there is a temptation to turn in those very identity-led pieces. And I've seen, I think there was, I can't remember if it was Slate or something, I called it the first-person industrial complex. And and that's sort of faded away a bit now, I think, because Facebook and Google have taken so much advertising money. But, I just think when you see 24-year-olds writing about the fact that they've slept with their father, or they've found a cat's hairball in their vagina, you think, in 10 years' time, when you want to write about covering Parliament or something, like, what's your job after that? Where does it go? What skills have you acquired? And I don't disrespect anybody who needs to pay their rent, but as an industry, that does feel very exploitative.
I think we're vaguely running out of time, and we are going to move back onto hot takes and talk about your own writing. But before we move, just on the subject of economics and paying writers, the New Statesman has had a reputation for not paying people in the past.
I don't know why it's got this, because this is 4 or 5 years ago now. It's sort of fascinating to me. And actually, it was the same conversation about interns. There was a big toorah about interns for a really long time ago. And we've had a policy instituted during my reign, so post 2012, of we only have interns through structured schemes. So we have the Welcome Fellowship, which we've now done Scholarship, which we've now run for 3 or 4 years. We work with the Social Mobility Foundation, and we work with our owners' foundation, the Dancing Foundation, on that. So, I think that now I get people begging me for work experience who were really happy to work unpaid. And I kind of think I would never have wanted to... Because the way the work experience works, right, is either you have people in for a week and actually they're a net drain on your resources, because you need to teach them how to use computer systems, you need to show them with the lure, you need to, whatever. And mostly they want to kind of write blogs, which you then, if they do that, you have to sort of spend a lot of time editing them, working them and showing them through drafts. And so actually they get a lot more, it's essentially teaching time, really, that, but taking someone away from their job. Or you do the old model, which was definitely in operation when I was a young journalist, of people who would be unpaid interns for like 11 months. Yeah. And at that point, then it's really tipped, right? And then the organisation is getting a lot more out of them than they're getting out of it. And it's narrowing journalism down to people essentially whose parents live in London, so they can stay in their spare room, or who are just incredibly wealthy. So we don't have unpaid internships, and we pay for all our pieces and have done now for years. But it's really fascinating.
What about the administration of pay? I mean, again, so I kind of did my first long form pieces for the New Statesman years ago, and was remain grateful for the opportunity that I had to do that. But we were talking off air beforehand. I think getting paid, and this wasn't in recent years, but getting paid by the New Statesman was, I think the most onerous experience I've had with any publication ever in my entire life on 2 continents.
Right. I'm very, very sorry about that. I think it's when you're a small organisation, and we are part of a bigger organisation, it's just, the infrastructure is just not as robust as it is somewhere that's, my favourite freelance commissions are from the BBC, right? Because although they just send you endless amounts of paper, they send you like 2 lots of paperwork for the same thing, but they pay you instantly on time because it's a massive, massive organisation. And it has always been the case that smaller publications have been a lot more dragging their feet on it. As an editor, it's incredibly frustrating if there's some kind of hold up, often because there's only one person who can sign off payments, and that's the kind of thing that holds it up. But it's one of the things that is ultimately out of the control of editorial. Right? It's not. Although,
it seems, and again, this is not in the current regime, but I remember, when you're like calling for the 15th time to chase your thing, it did seem again there was a sort of element of living your values. This is a publication that is of the left and is sort of preaching about workers' rights and stuff like that. To not pay people it struck me as shabby. To not have that basic investment in a proper functioning system for people who are writing freelance. Now that may have changed, but again, it seemed this sort of weird irony that places that preach brutal free market fundamentalism have like payroll markets that function like gleaming machines, and the traditional publications of the left like fuck you.
No, I take your point, but it's also the fact that whether or not you've got to have limited power and control, right? Is that there are lots of things that I can do, and I can lean on the accounts department if that was something that came up, but ultimately it's not my decision, and that's
whose decision is it?
Well, it's the commercial side of the company, which is not the editorial side of the company, and that's got its advantages and disadvantages. In the same sense that we don't take any, we're never pressured into taking adverts that we don't want to take, for example. But it means that they operate and they run themselves like a small business.
Mm. Moving on to some of the things that you sent us to read, and we'll link to them in the show notes. I really enjoyed your profile of Sue Black, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you chose to write about her. Just walk us through the story a little bit and talk about some of the struggles, perhaps in structure and that kind of writing.
Yeah, let me try and remember what the first original inspiration for that piece was. I think it was from the fact that she did maybe the Life Scientific with Jamal Khalili on Radio 4, and she talked about her career. And I was really struck by the fact that she had, she both did lots of stuff about identification of dead people. She worked in former Yugoslavia, identifying victims of war crimes, and there were kind of snipers in the hills and landmines.
But then there's the whole paedophile, like the live people bit as well.
And then she identifies, and they have the Human Identification Unit at Dundee, in which they look for, strange malformations in your nails or something like that, unusual markings or moles or whatever it might be, that they can look at, often abuse and child abuse images where the people are very careful to crop their faces out to find other identifying marks, and they look to whether or not the veins on the back of your hand, for example, are as distinctive as a fingerprint, because what happens is they are affected by the environment in the uterus, right? So everyone has a kind of basic grid for how their body is laid out, but all your moles and freckles and how your skin distributes themselves, all of that happens in utero, so they're not even identical in identical twins. So that's the kind of stuff that they look at. But I try and select people who I think have got an interesting story and I think can talk interestingly about it. Those are the two halves of that. So I went up to Dundee, and Sue was very kind and gave me several hours, showed me around her morgue, showed me someone who was dead being pumped full of they have a new embalming fluid that's much better than formaldehyde.
What does a morgue smell like?
Nothing. That was a really fascinating thing about it. I thought it would smell antiseptic, but they don't.
It is named after crime writers, right?
Yeah, they do. They have the Val McDermid morgue, and then they have the Jack Reacher.
Not the child morgue.
Because it couldn't be called the child mortuary. But they have a special air conditioning that sucks down rather than upwards. So you have a room full of dead people and sheets, and then it doesn't smell of anything. It's kind of fascinating. But I just thought she had a phenomenal story to tell, and is so as far as I can tell, completely unaffected by it. And has children herself who are now grown up, but was looking at all these images of incredible cruelty and pain.
I read, like Simon, you had this discussion with Medium about this particular piece, and one of the things I really liked, I thought it was actually a great piece of advice, was how you began writing and stitched this piece together. Could you reiterate that?
So I couldn't find the intro to it for a really long time, so now when I'm writing long form, what I try and do is write it in slices or vignettes and think of it more like a novel or a screenplay, and try and kind of basically think of it like a string of pearls, and you're just trying to thread each pearl onto it, and then you build up, and then at the end of it you've got a necklace. So the classic way to do a profile is very, very formulaic. I'm sure we've all done it, which is you start in the middle of something, so it's kind of like, oh God, I never realised, the first time I realised that I had 3 legs was on Tuesday, says blah, 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 and then you do your sort of top bit, and then you kind of go, born in 1967, blah, 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 and then you go back and do the bio, and then kind of go back into it. And I thought, well, you've got a bit more time to, tell the story out over in these luxurious magazine pages. So I'm going to try a couple of different ways of writing this. So Ollie Franklin-Wells, who did that interview, who's recently a commissioning editor at Wired, said, the thing he picked up about that is I don't have direct quotes. And for quite a long time in it, it's told through her voice. So it's told based around things that she told me, but I put them into indirect speech. And I think that's something that you have to have a certain amount of confidence to do, and also a luxury to do, because if you're doing a Saturday newspaper interview, and I've done them too, what they want is lots of quotes, so they can have a quote headline, and they actually ideally want a newsline out of somebody. So I'm thinking the Guardian had a Christopher Eccleston interview that was Christopher Eccleston had been blacklisted by the BBC after Doctor Who. And, therefore there is a premium on putting everything in quotation marks. But actually it's not necessarily the most compact way to tell a story. And I did a couple of pieces for Neiman Reports, which is a US journalism magazine, and they were militant about only letting you have quotes for stuff that added value right? You weren't allowed just to deliver facts through the medium of quotes, which I thought was a really big difference. But actually it really helped my writing, because it makes you tell things in a much more novelistic way, and then what you do is you use quotes because you want that person's voice particularly. And so the first quote from her is, because she's incredibly beautifully red-headed, she talks about, I tan as well as a snowball, and that's the first time you get a quote from her, and that's something that I would, that's just her incredibly vivid language that you just get much better in direct quotes, but not to stuff everything full of direct speech just because it's kind of pads out the word count.
How much writing are you able to do with the commitments for your other job of say, pieces of that scale?
Yeah, not as much as I'd like. I think last year I did 3 profiles and a couple of other long pieces. So I profiled the theatre director Robert Icke, I profiled the playwright James Graham, I profiled a guy who blows stuff up in a quarry. He runs a counter explosives business called Sydney Alford, and then I wrote a long piece on Hamilton. But I'm sure there was one at the beginning of the year. But yeah, that one every 2 months would be quite.
And again, without sort of bashing the money drum too hard, but we always try and ask about it. If you're freelancing for the New Statesman for that kind of piece, what can you expect to be paid?
You can expect, not bad rates actually. That's the thing. It's been really interesting to see to me is that, for a column, £300 would be a kind of normal standard rate for that. And that, I used to think when I started that was less than other people getting in other places, but actually rates have fallen. And I've talked to freelancers in other places. We do invest more in other pieces than that. For reported pieces, and we've had funding as well. We work with the Pulitzer Foundation for Crisis Reporting to fund reporting in Zimbabwe, for example. So we do pay people more than 30p a word, but that's that's a kind of reasonable level of fee.
So for a sort of 4,000 word piece,
you probably have more than that, but that'd be a kind of thing. And some of the people who would write that would be on contracts anyway, so it would work out as more. Okay. But it's it is what it is, and we have put serious investment in that. But I think now when I write for other places, they do not pay me a lot more than I get here, which I think is interesting and different. Maybe I'm just terrible.
I think it's
bargaining.
This is again not at all unique to you, but I think when we've spoken to other editors in this field in the UK, they're asking people to write ambitious long form fiction for that amount. Sorry, non-fiction for that amount, which it's a fraction of what the Americans pay, right?
Oh yeah.
And again, obviously there's very basic economic realities like differences in circulation and stuff like that, but I often find in discussion of like why we don't have that tradition here and things, the bored financial facts are.
No, I've written for stuff in the US and got $1 a word, and you kind of go, what? I'm sorry, you want to pay me how much? And there are places that pay more than us, but I know very, very senior feature writers in the UK, who said that, well, I won't work for less than 50p a word, but I'm finding that really difficult to kind of argue now. And that's about a rate of money that we might pay people. And I can see that there is a problem, which is, and I think it's about the way that the US doesn't really have a kind of single one comprehensive newspaper that, the New York Times has got a massive circulation, obviously, but it's very much situated in a particular place. It's not a national newspaper in quite the same way that we have it. So there are all these magazines that kind of are truly kind of pan-American, and therefore I can see why, and the thing they're selling themselves on, because they're monthlies or whatever it might be, is long-form reporting. Yeah. Whereas the primary dominant form of news here and print journalism here is the newspapers, and because they're daily and they've got websites attached, then they can do opinion a lot easier. Try and write a column for a monthly magazine. It's like, what will still be in date in 6 months' time? So, here, I think the people who get paid really whacking salaries often are op-ed columnists. They're the things that you sell the paper on, right? You want to read the paper for Owen Jones or Charles Moore or whoever it might be.
Or indeed Polly Vernon, which is the next piece we wanted to ask about.
Oh, right, okay. Eek. It's the embarrassed Helen Lewis half. No, it's fine, no. It's fine. But yeah, so I think that's the thing, is that I think in terms of the financial reward, we have skewed ours towards op-ed because that's what a lot of people want to do. It's quite glamorous, it seems to be quite easy, and also it's where the kind of big financial rewards are.
I'll let Kassia pose the next question.
Yes. Why are you so mean?
Oh, sorry.
That's what you're going to ask me, I'm presuming.
So, yes, we wanted to ask about your review of Hot Feminist, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your opinion of the piece and what you thought of the book.
So The Guardian asked me to review, and it was in the kind of post-Catelyn Runway where every woman and their dog were getting a book about feminism, and quite a lot of them, let's be honest, were knocked out quite quickly and not very good. And this was the absolute apogee of this. It was just appalling. And, I thing that really annoyed me about it is I felt that Polly Venn is essentially a good journalist and writer, and there were bits of it where they were quite good, but she had basically written a book with a provocative title, and because then they could put a picture of her on the front and it would go on the table in Waterstones with all the other lady books and probably sell a load. And when you write something like that, and I was very mean about it, very mean about it, but when you write something like that, not only is there, I mean, I'm not a natural, I don't know why I'm lying to myself saying I'm natural, not a natural hatchet man. I am, fortunately I am. And I actually try and restrain myself and be nicer most of the time.
She said that Helen is currently wearing a jumper that says feminist killjoy.
Feminist killjoy, that is my role in life. But, do you know what, and I still feel like this about when you know, and quite often when you're a critic, you know, you will know people, and, you know, theatre criticism I think is riddled with this, right, is that everybody sees each other at press nights, and you will have to run into people that you feel really horrible about. And then that kind of world, it's very hard not to have kind of conflicted loyalties. I mean, the ideal critic is basically a kind of sociopath who never leaves their house, because then they will never be tainted by any kind of personal friendships or relationships. But in a situation like that, I just think, you know what, that book was probably selling for what, $10.99? Some people that's an hour's pay, right? That's a lot of money. And the same thing, particularly when I'm reviewing theatre, which the prices are often crazy, right? A stall seat for 65 quid, or even a seat in the balcony is 25 quid. So if two of you are going to get 50, you know, never mind a babysitter, never mind anything else, then your duty is to those people to go, I respect your money, don't spend it on this crap. And if that upsets people that you're going to have to run into at a party, then sorry, like, that's just, they should have, I don't know, that's when I get quite cold and I just think, well, you should have made it better then.
Were you conscious of, you know, perhaps a sort of structural tension here, which is that if, you know, this word, feminism or this movement, makes a play for encompassing the hugely divergent experiences of millions of women of different things, you know, in any walk of life, it seems that there's going to be disagreements and disputes, and there needs to be a debate and a discussion. But that's very difficult to square with a line of thought and theory that claims to be representing 51% of the population, right? I mean, is that a tension you're conscious of?
It's not entirely how I don't see feminism as representing 51%. I see it as an intellectual tradition that seeks to kind of unpick the structural dynamics of gender. I know that probably sounds like an incredibly fine distinction, but there was particularly a couple of years ago, a real tendency to sort of say, like, anything that a woman does is empowering and therefore feminist, right? So if I wear high heels, that's feminist. And you kind of go, well, no, it's not the same as saying you can't wear high heels and be feminist, but you can't just reclaim things. Or the idea that, you know, just, you know, women doing stuff is sort of innately feminist in itself. That's a very strange thing that
we were discussing this before when we were, I find the same. But I think this is a neat segue into something that you do believe, which is that you're now currently writing a book, and could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a history of feminism in currently 9 fights. Who knows how many number of fights will be by the time I finish.
Proliferating.
It might be 100,000 fights. But what I wanted to do really was, I thought that, you know, Caitlin Moran's book was phenomenal, and I think awakened an entire generation to feminism. But she wrote it very much from the prism of kind of writing it from her life outwards, and did encompass a lot of theory in that. But I think that to me, it's such a rich intellectual tradition and a practical tradition that I think has really been lost. I think we're really terrible at telling those kind of stories. I remember Harriet Harman had a thing, the reason that she wrote her memoir, she said, was that she was tired of turning to the index of New Labour memoirs and finding herself not there. You know, and she was deputy leader of the party for a really long time. She was involved in some of its most crucial legislation, like the Equality Act. And just being kind of just that all being sort of slightly written out, basically. So what I wanted to do was talk to a lot of second wave feminists while they're still around, you know, a lot of them are in their 70s and 80s, and go back a bit further and kind of sort of say, well, hang on a minute, how did we get to here? You know, it's a movement that is incredibly splintered, but that's not a new thing at all. So I've been just writing a chapter on the vote, and you know, there were only around, I think it's like about 1,000 to 1,500 militant suffragettes. So lots of people who kind of moved in and out of the Women's Social and Political Union, and were in, you know, obviously lots of suffragists too, and from other unions too. But, you know, even within that many people, they had some pretty spectacular, one load of people flounced out quite early on. Their biggest donors, the Pethick Lawrences, left in, I think, 1913 in a spectacular falling out with the Pankhursts, right? These are not new, like, the idea that feminism is riddled with tensions is not, there was no pre-lapsarian time when everyone in feminism really got along. Even in the vote, which brought together women from such incredibly different political traditions, you know, you had sort of proper, like, left-wing anarchists versus people who then went on to be fascists in the 30s, were all in the same movement because it was just for one thing. But even then it was riddled with tension.
Talking of, with time for time, but I think this would be an interesting place to wrap up on the practical traditions. Can you tell us a bit about how the practicalities of selling that book worked? Agent, publisher, how did that all, and also fitting it with your other commitments?
Yeah, people had said had asked me for because I write a lot of columns on feminism, did I want to write a book on feminism? My standard reply was, I'd rather put my hand into a bear trap, thank you very much. And I remember when I told another journalist that I was writing this book on feminism, he said, "Oh, really good. I look forward to the spiteful Sarah Vine review in the Daily Mail." And that's the problem, is you have to go into it knowing that there are a couple of things that will definitely happen. One is that all the people who hate feminism and think you've gone too far will just say that, you're a kind of whiny, joyless, whatever. And two, everyone will pick it apart like nobody's business, and like they wouldn't do to a book by a man for the one thing that you've left out and overlooked.
And who will be those pickers?
Well, that'd be other feminists. Because we just apply, I think, look at Hillary Clinton, we just apply a higher standard of scrutiny and perfection we expected from women. And I took to Robert Webb. He wrote he wrote a book called How Not to Be a Boy, which is an absolutely beautiful book, but it is incredibly analogous to Caitlin Moran's book. So her book is really about a working class girl in a kind of chaotic family where lots of people didn't go to school. There were loads of kids, and in the Midlands. And kind of what she learned from that and how her life developed, along with some insights about gender along the way. Robert Webb's book is about a boy from a chaotic family, there's some with his dad and violence and drink in the Midlands, and using that to make some insights into gender. And what there has not been, Rob's book has been incredibly successful, is just that frenzied level of, why haven't you covered this? Why haven't you done this? What about this? And I said to him, has anyone raised, why there's no discussion of transgender issues in the book? And he said, well, no. And I said, what about race? And he said, well, I talk a bit about the fact, there was one black guy at my school and we called him Black Steve because this was the 80s and, political correctness hadn't got as far as, Lincolnshire by this point. But, there was not this sort of expectation that he could speak one universal, truthful male experience, which I think was the standard that was applied to Caitlin Moran's book, which is it looks like being progressive, but it's actually incredibly conservative because it's just applying a much higher bar for people, for women to clear. I think
that was the point I was trying to raise earlier. That, but do you not see that sort of one thing follows the other? If, maybe not yourself, but there are people who, writing these columns, you said, I am X because of Y, therefore I can talk on Z, making a play from their identity to some universalist point. That is a road that leads to, why doesn't this, as you say, this impossible criticism, why doesn't this represent everything?
Yeah, and it's an argument I've had with people about the media's coverage of transgender issues, when there is a big strain of activist thought that says that only trans people should write about the subject. And I've argued back and said, well, actually, feminists have had a critique of gender for a really long time, and actually I find that fundamentally quite a conservative position, because it's sort of saying, if you're going to fundamentally redefine when take away and say you can't talk about biology in relation to being a woman, for example, it's actually all about gender identity and not a kind of fusion of the two, as I think it probably is, then you've redefined everyone. Not just your own group, but everyone's group. And I think a lot of those kind of, when people are writing from that very one perspective, it's sort of I think it's very much there's no such thing as society, right? If you say you can only write about immigration if you're an immigrant, you ignore the experience that everybody else lives in a society that's shaped by immigration. And I understand the impulse behind it from marginalised communities, and I feel very strongly in the case of women that you don't want only men writing our stories and writing our lives. But equally well, I don't think you can ever just have a conversation that is only by people who purchase entry by their kind of identity token, because that's fundamentally a sort of weirdly, libertarian kind of conservative outlook. There's not one that I subscribe to.
Well, listen, thanks for being such a nice light note to finish on.
When can we expect the book?
About a year.
And the reactions to the book.
Exactly. Look out for that mean-spirited Sarah Vine takedown in about 2 years' time.
You're already in the bunker, so you can just down here. Anyway, listen, Helen, thank you for being such a super guest.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me on.
Great to have you. Hello, it's us again with a swift update from our lives. Kassia, what have you been up to?
I've had sort of a bit of a deadline whirlwind, which is what happens when you're freelance. And so I've spent the last few days kind of manically trying to get pieces and write them as fast as possible, which is one of the reasons why I think I like that piece of advice from Helen so much. Simon, how about you?
I'm having a week off. which is for a change, which is quite exciting. I filed a section of my book.
What kind of section of your book?
A much too long section of my book.
How much longer was it than what you intended?
3 times as long.
Simon's poor editor.
Yeah, well, it was better, I think. Anyway,
3 times better.
In response to that, they've delayed publication of my book. But I think that's for the best. So yeah, I'm taking this week off, and then back to the endless grindstone next week. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted as ever by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Kassia Sinclair.
Our producers are Olivia Crellin, Ed Kiernan and Liz Davies.
Social media is by Zara Hankier, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
We're on all manner of social media. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always, and our website is alwaystakenotes.com.
And as ever, do please leave us a review. It really helps. Thank you for listening.